What if I told you that a medieval knight, the very symbol of honor, chivalry, and battlefield glory, often spent far more time trying to make money than trying to save kingdoms? When people hear the word knight, they usually picture shining armor, a war horse, a castle in the distance, maybe even a noble lady watching from a tower while banners flap dramatically in the wind. It feels cinematic. It feels noble. It feels like the whole job description was basically ride into battle and look magnificent doing it. But here's the problem. Most of medieval Europe was not at war all the time. So what exactly did knights do when there was no crusade, no siege, no 100 Years' War battle, no great clash between kings? Did they just sit around polishing armor and reciting courtly poetry from Arthurian romance? Did Lancelot and Percival-style adventures somehow pay for the horses, the swords, the squires, the food, and the very expensive lifestyle attached to noble status? Not really. The answer is much more practical, and honestly, much more interesting. They were trying to make a living, and not in a calm, respectable, stable income kind of way. More in a high-risk, high-cost, aggressively competitive, possibly life-ruining financial model kind of way. In other words, many medieval knights were not just warriors. They were part athlete, part investor, part gambler, and part armed entrepreneur. Once you start looking at medieval knighthood through the lens of money, a lot of the romantic fog begins to clear. The world of chivalry starts looking less like a fairy tale and more like a brutal economic system with horses. Welcome to my channel. This is To the Lighthouse. Today we will discuss what medieval knights were really doing when they were not at war, and why the tournament economy, the ransom system, and the financial logic of chivalry tell us more about medieval society than all the polished armor in the world. A lot of people assume that knights were automatically rich. After all, they were nobles. They had land, status, servants, family names, and in popular imagination, apparently unlimited access to horses that looked amazing in manuscripts. But the truth is much messier. Some great lords were indeed wealthy, but most knights were not grand princes living in endless luxury. Many were minor nobles. They had some land, some rights over peasants, maybe a manor, maybe not much more. Their social rank was high, but their cash flow was often much less impressive. This becomes a problem very quickly when you consider the cost of being a knight. A full set of medieval armor was expensive. A trained warhorse was even more expensive. Then there were lances, swords, shields, mail, saddles, horse armor, travel costs, retainers, squires, and the constant need to maintain all of it. Knightly life looked glamorous from a distance, but economically it was a machine that burned money. To remain a mounted warrior in medieval Europe was to carry the financial burden of an elite profession without any guarantee of stable income. So if war was not constant, and if noble rank did not always mean deep pockets, how did knights survive? This is where the story gets good. They fought in tournaments. Now, when modern people hear the phrase medieval tournament, they often imagine a neat, elegant joust. Two armored men ride toward each other with lances, while a crowd applauds politely. It feels like sport, with a little pageantry on top. But the early medieval tournament, especially in 12th century France, was much rougher and much closer to an organized mock war than to a clean sporting event. Historians often associate its development with Chrétien de Troyes, and from the beginning the point was not simply style, spectacle, or romance. It was skill, violence, and profit. A tournament could involve dozens or even hundreds of knights. Groups charged at each other across open ground. Men were unhorsed, chased, struck, captured, and dragged into a chaotic swirl of controlled violence that was only controlled in the loosest possible sense. If this sounds less like a refined noble game and more like medieval combat with branding, that is because it basically was. And the real money was not in winning a decorative prize. The real money was in taking prisoners. This is one of the most important things to understand about medieval knighthood. In the knightly world of feudal Europe, an enemy noble was often more valuable alive than dead. If you captured another knight in battle or in a tournament, he could be forced to pay ransom for his release. That ransom might be a horse, armor, cash, or a substantial financial settlement depending on his rank, family, and wealth. Suddenly, the tournament stops looking like a mere game and starts looking like a market. Knights were not only competing for honor, they were competing for revenue. This ransom economy shaped the logic of chivalry itself. Chivalry is often presented as a code of honor, courage, loyalty, and courtly refinement. And yes, those ideals mattered. They filled the pages of medieval literature and helped define aristocratic identity. You see them in Arthurian legend, in the stories of King Arthur, Lancelot, Gawain, and Percival. You see them in the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, where the knight is always on the move, always facing tests, always trying to prove that he is worthy of fame. But behind those glittering ideals was a very practical reality. The wandering knight of medieval romance was not just pursuing abstract virtue. He was participating in a world where reputation could bring invitations, where victory could bring wealth, and where martial success had direct economic value. Once you notice that, the literature starts to look a little different. Take Chrétien de Troyes, one of the great writers of 12th century medieval literature and a foundational figure in Arthurian romance. In works like Lancelot and Percival, knights are constantly traveling, entering contests, facing rival warriors, and proving themselves through action. On the surface, this looks like a literary celebration of heroic virtue, but it also reflects the social environment of feudal Europe, where noble status depended on visible displays of martial competence. A knight who stayed home did not build renown. A knight who built no renown gained no opportunities, and in a world where fame, loyalty, patronage, and wealth were tightly linked, that was a serious problem. Move forward into the 14th century, and the picture becomes even more revealing. In Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the knight is introduced as a man who has fought in many campaigns across the known world. He is experienced, widely traveled, and deeply shaped by war. That portrait feels literary, but it also echoes the reality of a European martial aristocracy whose members could live like highly mobile professionals, moving from one conflict zone to another, from one patron to another, from one opportunity to the next. The knight in medieval literature is not just a dream figure. He often preserves the social logic of a class that made its living through violence. And this was not limited to tournaments. The same financial logic was built directly into medieval warfare. One of the most famous examples comes from the 100 Years' War. In the year 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, the English captured King John II of France. What followed was not just a military disaster, but a financial catastrophe. His ransom was set at an enormous sum, one so large that it strained the resources of the French kingdom itself. That moment shows with brutal clarity how ransom worked at the highest level. In medieval war, capturing an important noble could mean access to extraordinary wealth. The battlefield was also a marketplace, and rank determined value. Once you understand that, the medieval knight stops looking like a simple hero and starts looking like a participant in a violent aristocratic economy. Armor was capital, horses were capital, training was capital. Reputation was social capital in the most literal sense. A successful knight might gain patronage, marriage prospects, political influence, and direct material profit. A failed knight could lose his horse, his armor, his freedom, or his life. This was not fantasy. It was a harsh and expensive profession. And this is also why tournaments mattered so much beyond entertainment. They were not just spectacles for bored nobles, they were mechanisms. They gave knights a place to train, a place to display status, a place to build fame, and a place to extract wealth from one another without the full political consequences of private war. In a society saturated with armed men of noble birth, that mattered. Feudal Europe needed ways to channel elite violence. The tournament did exactly that. It transformed aggression into ritual, competition into prestige, and danger into a form of economic circulation. That does not mean it was safe, of course. Medieval tournaments could be incredibly dangerous. Men were injured, horses were killed, and things could spiral out of control very quickly. The church often criticized tournaments for precisely this reason. Clergy saw them as wasteful, prideful, violent, and spiritually suspect. Yet, despite repeated criticism, tournaments endured because they served a social purpose. They kept the warrior class occupied. They reinforced hierarchy. They provided a theater in which noble identity could be performed and tested. Most importantly, They made economic sense for the people involved. This is where the modern fantasy of the knight begins to crack in a fascinating way. Popular culture loves the idea of pure chivalry, the noble warrior, the honorable duel, the shining champion defending the weak. Medieval people loved those stories too, which is why Arthurian legend became so powerful, and why characters like Lancelot and Percival endured. But literature often gives us ideals, while history gives us systems. The system behind medieval knighthood was not only about courage, it was also about cost, competition, and survival. That tension becomes even clearer when we jump ahead to the early modern period and arrive at Miguel de Cervantes. By the time Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, the world that had once sustained real knightly culture was fading. Gunpowder had changed warfare. Infantry had become more important. States were building stronger administrative and military structures. The old model of the mounted aristocratic warrior, privately equipped and sustained by a mixture of land, patronage, war, and tournament profit, no longer held the same central place. So when Don Quixote rides out imagining himself as a knight errant from an older age, the joke lands because the economic and social reality beneath chivalry has already collapsed. That is what makes Don Quixote such a powerful ending point for this story. Cervantes is not just mocking a delusional man, he is also exposing the afterlife of a dead system. The heroic language remains. The romances remain. The names of old ideals remain. But the material world that once made those ideals meaningful is gone. The knight survives as nostalgia, satire, and literature. And maybe that is the bigger lesson here. When people talk about medieval history, medieval literature, Arthurian romance, or chivalry, there is often a temptation to separate ideas from economics, as if honor belongs to one realm and money belongs to another. But in the actual world of feudal society, those things were deeply entangled. Honor could bring profit. Profit could sustain honor. The image of the knight depended not only on virtue but on resources. Even glory needed funding. So if you could actually go back to medieval Europe and become a knight, chances are your daily life would be much less like a stained glass window and much more like a stressful financial balancing act in armor. You would worry about horses, equipment, alliances, and debts. You would care very much about who might ransom well. You would measure prestige not only in songs and stories, but in what it could buy you tomorrow. And if there were no war, you would probably be heading to the next tournament, hoping to win enough to keep the whole expensive performance going. That is what makes the medieval knight so interesting. He was not merely a warrior wrapped in romance. He was part of a social machine. He stood at the intersection of feudal hierarchy, aristocratic culture, medieval warfare, tournament sport, and economic necessity. Once you see that, the glittering image of chivalry does not disappear. It just becomes more human, more fragile, and strangely more compelling. Because the truth is, some of the most romantic chapters of medieval Europe were held together by ledgers, ransom payments, and the constant pressure to turn violence into income. And maybe that is why this story still feels so modern. The costumes have changed, the horses are gone. The lances are no longer fashionable, but the logic is familiar. Prestige is expensive, status has maintenance costs. Public performance often hides private anxiety, and behind many beautiful myths, there is usually a balance sheet. Thanks for joining me today. See you at the next lighthouse.